The chandeliers of Blackwood Manor did not so much illuminate the grand dining hall as they dripped light, thick and golden as honey, onto the scene below. It pooled on the polished mahogany of the long table, caught in the facets of a dozen crystal wine goblets, and slid across the heavy silver of the serving platters. It was a room built for pronouncements, for the settling of fortunes and the display of power. Tonight it was a stage, and every guest a player, though only one of them seemed to believe she was the star. Isabelle de Valois, seated to the right of the Duke of Allister, was a masterpiece of curated beauty. Her gown, a deep sapphire silk, made the pale cream of her skin appear luminous, and the diamonds at her throat were no brighter than the calculated sparkle in her eyes. She had been holding court for the duration of the meal, her voice a low, confident melody that wove through the polite clatter of cutlery and the murmur of conversation. Eleanora Vance, seated halfway down the table among the lesser relations and tolerable neighbors, heard it all. She was practiced in the art of being invisible, a skill honed by years of genteel poverty and the particular loneliness of being a guest by sufferance. Her dress was a dove-gray muslin, her only adornment a small silver locket containing a lock of her father's hair. She was not a participant in the evening's drama. She was merely a witness, a piece of unobtrusive furniture that happened to be able to breathe. "Of course, the tapestries in the West Gallery are simply moribund," Isabelle was saying, her delicate hand waving away a century of ducal history. "Once Allister and I are formally settled, I shall have them replaced with something far more vibrant. From Paris, I think." A ripple of carefully concealed interest went around the table. The phrase, "formally settled," was a stone tossed into the placid waters of aristocratic speculation. Lord Ashworth, a man whose primary occupation was the collection of gossip, leaned forward. "Formally settled, you say, Madame de Valois," he ventured, his eyes gleaming. "Should we be preparing our congratulations for His Grace?" The room fell into a sudden, expectant hush. The servants, gliding with their silver trays, seemed to hold their breath. All eyes turned first to Isabelle, who gave a small, triumphant smile, a silent confirmation. Then they shifted, as one, to the man at the head of the table. The Duke of Allister, Julian, had a face that seemed carved from the same stone as his ancient manor, all hard angles and shadowed planes. He had not smiled once all evening. His gaze, a cool, distant gray, had been fixed on some point beyond the damask walls. Now, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes, he slowly lowered his wineglass to the table. The click of crystal on wood was the only sound. He did not look at Isabelle. He did not acknowledge her proprietary smile or the flush of victory on her cheeks. Instead, his gaze swept down the long table, passing over the hopeful, the curious, and the sycophantic, until it rested for a brief, unreadable moment on Eleanora. It was not a look of recognition. It was the indifferent glance one might give a book left open on a chair, a momentary disruption in the landscape of the room. And then it moved on. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a shard of ice. "There will be no Duchess of Blackwood, Lord Ashworth," he said, his tone flat, devoid of any emotion. He addressed the man, but the statement was for the entire room. "The last one nearly brought this house to ruin. I do not intend to repeat the experiment." The devastation was immediate and catastrophic. It was a public execution delivered in a single, calm sentence. The color drained from Isabelle de Valois' face, leaving her painted lips a stark, clownish red against the sudden pallor of her skin. The triumphant sparkle in her eyes guttered and died, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated fury, swiftly masked by a look of profound hurt. She had called herself the future Duchess. The Duke had corrected her. He had corrected her before everyone, not by denying their association, but by denying the very possibility of the position she craved. He had not just rejected her, he had rejected the institution itself, making her ambition seem not only presumptuous, but foolish. Eleonora felt a strange, cold pity for the woman. It was a brutal thing to witness. But underneath the pity was something else, a quiet, sinking dread. The Duke's pronouncement was not merely a rebuke to his mistress, it was a statement of policy. A policy built from a past wound, a policy that declared this house, this life, a fortress against the perceived liabilities of affection. And Eleonora, a resident of that fortress by the thinnest of threads, understood the implication with perfect clarity. She was tolerated for her father's sake, a lingering debt of friendship the new Duke felt obliged to honor. But in a house where even a potential Duchess was deemed a risk too great, what was a penniless botanist's daughter? She was not a risk. She was an irrelevance. And irrelevancies, she knew, were the first to be cleared away when a man like Alistair decided to put his house in order. She picked up her water goblet, her hand perfectly steady, and took a slow, deliberate sip. She did not cry when she heard him say it. She simply filed it away, another piece of data in the long, quiet calculus of her survival. The great clock in the hall struck 11, each chime a heavy stone dropped into the well of the night. Eleonora did not wait for the awkward, fractured dispersal of the guests. She had perfected the art of the unnoticed exit. A slight push of her chair, a soft rustle of muslin, and she was a ghost slipping through the door, her departure no more noted than the sigh of a draft under the frame. The tension in the dining hall was a physical thing, thick and suffocating, and she craved the clean, cold air of the library. Her footsteps made no sound on the runner in the long gallery. Portraits of past dukes and duchesses watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with an air of somber judgment. The last one, a woman with a fragile smile and haunted eyes, was Julian's mother. The one before that, his brother's wife, the source of the ruin he spoke of, had been removed. A blank space of faded damask on the wall spoke more eloquently than any portrait could. This was a house that edited its history, that curated its memory. The library was her sanctuary. 2 stories of books, a universe of leather and paper and ink, smelling of beeswax and thyme. A fire slumbered in the grate, casting a warm, dancing light on the spines of 1,000 silent companions. She did not light a lamp. She moved through the familiar darkness to the alcove that housed her father's passion, the botanical collection. Here were the great folios, the detailed engravings of Linnaeus, the travelogues of explorers who had risked their lives for a single, undiscovered bloom. Her own work was on a small, tidy desk in the corner. For months, she had been cataloging the late Duke's acquisitions, cross-referencing them, creating an orderly system out of a gentleman collector's pleasant chaos. It was the official reason for her presence at Blackwood. It was a useful fiction. Her real work, her true purpose, lay beyond the stone walls of the manor, in the forgotten glass houses that sagged at the far end of the gardens. There, in the humid, earth-scented air, was the last living legacy of her father. A collection of rare orchids, entrusted to the old Duke, his friend and patron. After both their deaths, the collection had fallen into neglect. The fires that warmed the glass houses through the bitter winters were no longer consistently lit. The specialized compost her father had perfected was forgotten. When Eleonora had arrived, She found the precious plants languishing, their leaves yellowed, their roots clinging precariously to life. Saving them had become her quiet, consuming mission. It was a fight waged with patient, methodical care. It was a way to speak to her father across the veil of death, to prove herself worthy of the knowledge he had passed down to her. It was a purpose, sharp and clear, in a life that had become defined by ambiguity. Tonight, the Duke's words had stripped away the last of that ambiguity. I do not intend to repeat the experiment. He saw love, partnership, as a failed experiment. He saw women not as individuals, but as a category of risk. He saw Blackwood not as a home, but as a balance sheet, and his heart as an account to be kept firmly in the black. She ran a finger along the spine of a worn leather book, her father's own journal. His familiar script, full of notes and sketches, was a balm to her soul. He had believed in the generative, hopeful power of the world. He saw life and resilience in the smallest seed. His daughter, it seemed, was now living in the house of a man who saw only blight and decay. She would not allow herself the indulgence of despair. Despair was a luxury for women with fortunes and families to fall back on. For Eleonora, it was a weakness she could not afford. She had her father's mind, if not his name. She had his knowledge, his patience, and she had the orchids. Her decision, made in the silent, firelit library, was not a dramatic one. It was a quiet hardening, a turning inward. She would not leave. Where would she go? She had no money, no prospects. To leave would be to surrender the orchids to their slow death, to abandon the last tangible connection to her father. No, she would stay, but she would change the terms of her own existence. She would no longer be a guest by sufferance. She would become a resource. She would make herself not just useful, but indispensable. The Duke saw his estate as a set of problems. Very well, she would become a solution. She would pour all her energy, all her intellect, into the glasshouses, into the gardens. She would make them profitable. She would take her father's legacy and turn it into something even a man like the Duke of Allister could understand. An asset. She would build a parallel life of competence, a fortress of her own, not of stone and mortar, but of knowledge and skill. He could have his cold, empty dukedom. She would have her work. She would endure. And in her endurance, she would find a different kind of freedom. The freedom of a person who, having been deemed an irrelevance, was now free to pursue her own quiet, vital purpose, unseen and unhindered. She closed her father's journal, the soft thump of the cover a period at the end of a sentence. The reckoning was over. The work was about to begin. The months that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, not the social calendar of the great house. Eleonora rose before the maids, her first thought for the delicate hygrometers in the glasshouses. She spent her days with her hands in the soil, her mind deep in the complex chemistry of plant life. The initial resentment from the head gardener, Mr. Croft, a man who had served the estate for 40 years and was suspicious of a woman's interference, slowly melted away. It did not melt in the face of her charm, for she used none. It yielded grudgingly to the undeniable evidence of her competence. She did not command, she demonstrated. She showed him how a subtle change in the compost mixture, based on a formula from her father's journals, could revive a struggling camellia. She identified the tiny pest that was plaguing the espaliered pears, a pest he had been fighting with the wrong remedy for 2 years, and prescribed a simple organic solution that worked within a fortnight. She spoke his language, the language of mulch and rootstock, of blight and bloom. One crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, found Eleonora in the still room, surrounded by bunches of drying herbs. Mrs. Gable was a woman as solid and dependable as Blackwood's foundations, her face a road map of quiet observations. "The lavender harvest is twice what it was last year, Miss Eleonora," she said, her tone neutral, but her eyes held a spark of approval. "The linen closets will smell of summer all winter long." "The soil was depleted," Eleonora replied, not looking up from her task of stripping rosemary leaves from their stems. "I added wood ash and bone meal. The plants simply had what they needed to thrive." It was a simple statement, but Mrs. Gable caught the undertone. "Many things around here could do with being given what they need to thrive," she said, a pointed look on her face. She had been a silent witness to the slow decay of the estate's spirit long before the finances began to falter. She had seen the new Duke's cold pragmatism as a necessary evil, but she worried it was choking the life from the place. In Eleonora, she saw a different kind of pragmatism, one that nurtured instead of audited. The first tangible proof of Eleonora's success came not in the form of praise, but in a small, neat column in the estate's quarterly ledger. The steward, a dour man named Jennings, had at first dismissed her requests for funds to repair the glasshouse heating system as a frivolity. Eleonora had not argued. Instead, she had propagated a series of winter-blooming jasmine and sold them, through a discreet contact of her father's, to a florist in London who supplied the great houses for their winter balls. The sum was not vast, but it was unexpected. It was income from a part of the estate that had been written off as a drain for a decade. When Jennings presented the accounts to the Duke, he pointed to the line item with a grudging respect. "From the glass houses, Your Grace. Miss Vance's work." Alistair had merely nodded, his face betraying nothing. But he had taken to walking the grounds in the late afternoon, his path invariably leading him past the gardens. He saw the newly weeded beds, the neatly pruned roses, the restored gleam of the glasshouse panes. He saw tenants tipping their hats to Eleonora as she passed, a gesture of genuine respect, not rote deference. He saw life returning to a corner of his world he had considered dead. One afternoon, he found her not in the glasshouse, but in the apple orchard, directing two young garden boys in the careful harvesting of the winter apples. She was wearing a sturdy apron over her gray dress, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was explaining the importance of twisting the apple, not pulling it, to avoid bruising. Her voice was calm, patient, the voice of a teacher. He stood for a long moment, unseen, watching her. This was not the pale, silent girl from the dinner table. This was a woman in her element, confident and capable. He had dismissed her as an obligation, a relic of his father's sentimentality. But sentimentality did not produce a profit. Sentimentality did not command the respect of men like Croft and Jennings. He was a man who dealt in facts, in evidence, and the evidence before him was intriguing. He stepped out from behind the ancient oak where he had been standing. "Miss Vance." She turned, her eyes showing no surprise, only a quiet watchfulness. The garden boys immediately stiffened, their hands frozen in the branches. "Your Grace?" she said, her voice even. She did not curtsy. She simply inclined her head, a gesture of respect that was not subservient. "The steward informs me the gardens are showing a profit," he stated, his tone that of a man conducting an audit. "They are beginning to pay for their own keep," she corrected gently. "Profit is a more ambitious word, but the potential is there." Potential. He tested the word. It was a word he understood. He had spent his entire inheritance battling against negative potential, the potential for ruin. The idea of positive potential, of growth, felt foreign. What potential? The old Duke, your father, collected not just for beauty, but for utility, she explained, her gaze direct. There are medicinal herbs in the south garden that have been allowed to grow wild. The apothecary in the village pays a high price for them in London. The rose attar from the old damasks, if properly distilled, is worth more by weight than silver. And then there are the orchids. She stopped herself, as if she had said too much. The orchids? He prompted, a flicker of curiosity breaking through his reserve. They require specific conditions, she said, her expression closing off slightly. They are a longer-term investment. He looked from her determined face to the bustling, orderly work around them. He had inherited a title, a mountain of debt, and a legacy of scandal. He had set about managing it all with a ruthless, unsentimental efficiency. He had stripped away the superfluous, cut off the sentimental. And yet, here was this quiet, overlooked woman, turning a forgotten corner of his estate into a source of vitality, not through force of will, but through patient, intelligent care. He had thought himself the only one working to save Blackwood. He was beginning to suspect he was not. "Continue your work, Miss Vance," he said, the words feeling strangely inadequate. "The steward will approve any reasonable requests for supplies." It was not a compliment. It was not praise. But for Eleonora, it was something far more valuable. It was authorization. It was a recognition of her competence, not her person. And for now, that was more than enough. It was everything. The Duke's authorization was a key turning a lock. Eleonora did not hesitate. Reasonable requests, he had said. Her definition of reasonable, she knew, would test the limits of his. She presented Mr. Jennings with a list. New panes of glass for the propagation house, a wagon load of high-grade coal for the boilers, and a detailed order for specific soil components from a supplier in Bristol. Jennings blanched, but a curt note from the Duke's study ensured everything was approved. The work began in earnest. Alistair found himself drawn to the library more frequently. He told himself it was to consult maps of the estate's drainage systems, but he always seemed to arrive in the late evening, when he knew Eleonora would be there, updating her catalogues under the light of a single lamp. Their conversations began as transactional. "Miss Vance, do you know if my father's library contains anything on crop rotation for clay-heavy soil?" She would rise without a word, move to a shadowy section of the shelves, and return with 3 books, laying them on the table before him. "The 3rd volume is the most practical, Your Grace. The first 2 are more theoretical." She would then return to her desk, the conversation concluded. But slowly, the transactions became discussions. He would ask a follow-up question. She would provide a precise, well-reasoned answer. He learned that she had read every book in the botanical collection, not just catalogued them. He discovered that her knowledge was not merely academic, it was a living, breathing thing, connected to the soil and the seasons. One evening, he found her with a large folio open, its pages filled with exquisite, hand-painted illustrations of orchids. One, in particular, was a phantom-like white flower of impossible delicacy. "My father discovered this one," she said, her voice soft with memory. "In the mountains of Borneo. He called it Phalaenopsis eleonorae, a private jest. It was believed to be uncultivatable in this climate." "Was believed?" Alistair picked up on the past tense. A faint, secretive smile touched her lips for the first time. "Its needs are particular. It requires a consistent humidity of 90% and a temperature that never varies by more than 2 degrees, day or night." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the mousy dependent, but the daughter of a renowned scientist. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the discipline in the set of her jaw. "And you are providing these conditions in a glass house with a leaking roof and a faulty boiler?" "The roof has been repaired, Your Grace, and the boiler is now less faulty," she replied, with a hint of the dry wit he was beginning to recognize. "It is a challenge." It was during this period that Dr. Armitage became a more frequent visitor. A kind, scholarly man with gentle eyes and a genuine passion for botany, he came to see Eleonora, not the Duke. He would arrive with a new specimen for her to identify, or a question about a passage in a Latin text. They would walk through the gardens, their heads bent together in animated conversation, a comfortable ease between them that Alistair observed from his study window with a tightening in his chest he refused to analyze. He saw Armitage look at Eleonora with uncomplicated admiration. He heard their shared laughter, a sound rarely heard within Blackwood's walls. The doctor saw her, fully and completely. And Alistair, who had made a policy of not seeing anyone, felt a strange and unwelcome prick of something. He told himself it was irritation that his time with his most efficient resource was being interrupted. Isabelle de Valois had not been seen at Blackwood since the disastrous dinner party, but her presence lingered in London society's whispers. Alistair heard them on his rare trips to the city, that he was a cold-hearted brute, a man incapable of feeling. He accepted the charges with a shrug. They were, he thought, largely true, and therefore useful. They kept prospective, ambitious mothers with marriageable daughters at bay. But one afternoon, Isabelle, bolder than he had given her credit for, appeared at Blackwood unannounced. She swept into the front hall as if she still belonged there, her carriage laden with trunks. "Alistair, darling," she announced, tapping his arm with a fan. "I have forgiven you for your little display. We all have our melancholic moods. I've come to rescue you from yourself. We shall have a house party." She found him in the study, deep in conversation with Eleonora. They were bent over a map of the estate, Eleonora's finger tracing the path of a stream. The scene was one of quiet, focused collaboration. It was domestic, in a way that Isabelle's theatrical pronouncements had never been. Isabelle froze in the doorway, her eyes taking in the scene. She saw the shared intensity, the comfortable proximity. Her gaze narrowed, dismissing the map, the ledgers, the evidence of work. She saw only a man and a woman, and her face hardened into a mask of contempt. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "I see the mice have been playing while the cat was away. Or perhaps the cat has developed a taste for mice." She looked Eleonora up and down, her lip curling at the simple gray dress, the ink stain on her finger. "Tell me, dear, do you also darn his stockings?" Eleonora straightened slowly, her face pale, but her expression composed. She did not look at Isabelle. She looked at Alistair. It was a look of quiet inquiry. She was his employee, in a sense. This was his house. It was his place to handle the intrusion. Alistair rose to his full height. The cold fury he directed at Isabelle was terrifying in its stillness. "Isabelle," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "your carriage is waiting. I suggest you do not keep your horses standing." Her eyes widened. She'd expected him to be amused, to placate her, to dismiss Eleonora as a trifle. She did not understand that she had made a fatal error. She had not insulted Eleonora's person. She had insulted her work. She had walked into the one place where Alistair was beginning to see a glimmer of hope for his broken estate, and treated it like a drawing-room comedy. "But the house party," she stammered. "There will be no house party," he said. "I am occupied. As you can see, I have work to do." He gestured, not at Eleonora, but at the map, at the ledgers on his desk. But the implication was clear. Eleonora was part of the work. Isabel was a distraction. Defeated, humiliated for a second and final time, Isabel turned and swept from the room. A moment later, the sound of a carriage departing at speed echoed from the gravel drive. In the ensuing silence, Eleonora began gathering her papers. Her hands trembled slightly, the only sign of the scene's effect on her. "Your Grace," she began, her voice low. "Perhaps it would be best if—" "The stream you were indicating," Alistair interrupted, his voice rough. He would not acknowledge the personal drama. He would retreat to the safety of facts and figures. "You believe it can be used to irrigate the North Pasture?" She looked at him. His face was a mask of cold control, but she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of turmoil, a hint of the man behind the Duke. He was offering her a return to their new normal, a shared world of practical problems. It was an apology of a kind. It was the only kind he knew how to give. She put her papers down. "Yes," she said, her voice steadying. "I believe it can, with a great deal of work." "Work," he repeated, the word a strange sort of anchor for them both. "Show me." They bent over the map again, their shoulders almost touching. Outside, the world of social intrigue and petty cruelties receded. Inside the study, there was only the land, the work, and a fragile, unacknowledged partnership beginning to take root in the barren soil of Blackwood Manor. The first sign of the true crisis came not with a dramatic pronouncement, but with a faint, rust-colored dust on the leaves of the barley in the tenant fields. It began in the West Pasture, the one closest to the marshlands. At first, the tenants dismissed it as a common mildew, a consequence of a damp early summer. But it spread with an unnatural speed, moving like a slow, inexorable tide across the fields. By the second week, entire stalks were withered and gray, the nascent grains turning to black powder in their husks. Panic, a more virulent blight than any that could afflict a plant, began to take root in the village. The barley was not merely a crop. It was the tenants' livelihood, their food for the winter, and the source of the rent that kept the entire estate solvent. Mr. Jennings, the steward, was besieged by worried farmers. His own face grew longer and more grim with each passing day. Alistair summoned agricultural experts from London. They arrived in smart carriages, armed with microscopes and theories. They spoke of airborne fungi, of soil depletion, of weather patterns. They offered expensive, complicated remedies involving chemicals that had to be shipped from the continent, with no guarantee of success. The Duke spent a small fortune on their advice, and the blight continued its relentless march. Isabelle de Valois' parting shot had been more prescient than she knew. In a letter to a mutual acquaintance, which was gleefully shared with half of London, and eventually found its way back to Alistair, she wrote, "He is so consumed with his dirt and his ledgers, he will likely lose the whole estate for the sake of a pretty weed. A pity." The pretty weed was, Alistair knew, a contemptuous reference to Eleonora. The sentiment stung, not because it came from Isabel, but because it echoed a growing fear in his own heart. Was he losing sight of the larger picture? Was his focus on the minutiae of the gardens causing him to miss the catastrophe unfolding in his fields? Desperation began to fray the edges of his famous control. One evening, after a grim tour of the blighted fields, he found himself in the library, a bottle of brandy at his elbow. He was staring at the accounts, at the chasm that was about to open up beneath them, when Eleonora entered. She did not speak, but placed a single, withered stalk of barley on the polished desk beside his glass. She had been in the fields herself, he realized, not as a lady making a charitable visit, but as a scientist gathering a specimen. "This is not a common mildew," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have seen it before, in my father's books. It is Puccinia hordae, a stem rust. The London experts are wrong. Their chemical treatments will only poison the soil for next year's planting." Alistair looked from the dead plant to her intense, serious face. A wave of irrational anger surged through him. "And what would you know of it? You are a botanist of orchids and decorative flowers. This is agriculture. This is finance. This is my entire world crumbling to dust." He regretted the words as soon as they were out. The cruelty was born of fear, and it was aimed at the one person who had shown nothing but quiet competence. Eleonora did not flinch. Her gaze remained steady. "My father did not only study beautiful things, Your Grace. He studied resilient things. He studied what kills them and what allows them to survive. He documented a similar outbreak in Prussia in 1819. The cure is not chemical. It is mechanical and biological." "And what is this miracle cure?" he asked, his voice laced with a sarcasm he could not contain. "Fire," she said simply. "You must burn the affected fields. All of them. Before the spores can spread further on the wind. It must be done now, before the next rain. And then, you must introduce a competitor. The fields must be sown with winter rye. Its root system is aggressive. It will choke out any dormant spores and replenish the nitrogen in the soil. You will lose this year's barley harvest completely, but you will save the soil. You will save next year's harvest, and the year after that." He stared at her. What she was proposing was radical. To burn his own fields? To deliberately destroy what little remained of the crop? It went against every instinct. It sounded like madness. And then, Isabel's other, more foolish proposal came to mind. During one of their last arguments, she had suggested he sell off the water meadows, the very land his grandfather had drained at great expense, to a neighboring lord who coveted them. "It would cover your losses for the season," she had said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Selling the land would have been a quick, easy solution. It would also have been a betrayal of his family's legacy, and a death knell for the tenants who relied on the meadows for grazing. It was the solution of someone who saw land as a commodity, not a heritage. Eleonora's solution was the opposite. It was hard. It was costly in the short term. It required sacrifice and trust in the slow, patient processes of nature. It was a solution that looked not to the next season, but to the next decade. It was the solution of someone who understood the land as a living, breathing entity. He looked at her, standing there in the dim light of the library, the single stalk of blighted barley on his desk between them. She was not asking him to trust her. She was presenting him with facts, with a diagnosis and a prescription based on historical precedent. She was offering him a choice, not between hope and despair, but between two different kinds of hope. The false, easy hope of a quick fix, and the hard, earned hope of a difficult recovery. He stood up, the decision crystallizing in his mind. He walked to the bell pull. "Jennings is to gather every able-bodied man and woman," he said, not to the empty air, but to her. "We will start with the west pasture at dawn. I will need you to show me exactly where the fire breaks must be cut." He had placed his trust in London experts, and they had failed. He had listened to the advice of the well-connected, and it had been hollow. Now, with his back against the wall, he was going to place the future of his entire estate in the hands of a quiet woman who tended orchids. It was either the most foolish decision of his life, or the first truly wise one he had ever made. Before you continue with the rest of the story, if you're enjoying this tale of quiet competence and earned respect, please consider taking a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to bring more stories like this to you. Now, back to Blackwood Manor and the dawn that would change everything. The dawn broke gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter. A heavy mist clung to the ground, muffling sound and lending a spectral quality to the scene. The entire estate seemed to be holding its breath. Alistair stood on the rise overlooking the west pasture, Eleonora beside him. Below, a small army of tenants and estate workers stood ready, their faces grim, armed with scythes, shovels, and a shared anxiety. They looked to their duke, their expressions a mixture of fear and reluctant trust. Alistair had spent the night in a state of cold, clear focus. He had spoken to every tenant farmer himself, not commanding, but explaining. He had laid out the situation, the failure of the London experts, and the radical new plan. He did not mention Eleonora by name as the source. He took the full weight of the decision onto his own shoulders. "It is a risk," he had told them, "but the risk of doing nothing is greater. We will lose the harvest, but we will save the land. I will cancel all rents for the next 2 quarters. We will survive this together, or we will fail together." It was the longest speech many of them had ever heard him make. Now, in the pale morning light, it was Eleonora who gave the final instructions. She was not dressed as a lady of the manor. She wore a man's sturdy boots, borrowed from a garden boy. Her skirts were tucked up, and a canvas apron protected her dress. She spoke to the men not with the authority of rank, but with the authority of knowledge. "The fire break must be at least 10 feet wide," she explained, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. She pointed with a stick. "From that oak to the stone wall. The wind is coming from the east. We will light the fire here at the western edge and let it burn against the wind. It will move slowly. It will be controllable. Mr. Croft, your men will have the water carts ready at the fire break. Not a single spark is to cross it." The men, who had known her only as the quiet miss who worked in the gardens, looked at her with a new respect. She was not hysterical or emotional. She was calm, precise, and utterly in command of her subject. They looked at the Duke, who stood beside her, listening, nodding, deferring to her expertise. And a new understanding dawned on them. This was not the Duke's folly. This was a calculated plan. Alistair himself took up a torch. He looked at Eleonora. Her face was pale in the growing light, her expression one of intense concentration. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the fields, the tenants, the impending fire, all fell away. There was only the silent acknowledgement of the enormous trust he had placed in her. She gave a small, sharp nod. It was time. He strode to the edge of the blighted field and plunged the torch into the dry, withered stalks. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, a small tongue of flame licked upwards, hesitated, and then caught. A low whoosh rippled through the field as the fire began its slow, hungry work. The day was a blur of smoke, heat, and relentless labor. Alistair worked alongside his tenants, his face black with soot, his hands raw from wielding a shovel to beat back stray embers. He shed his fine coat, then his waistcoat, working in his shirt sleeves like any common laborer. He saw things he had never seen from the back of his horse or the window of his study. He saw the quiet courage of the old farmer, whose life's work was turning to ash before his eyes, yet who worked with a grim determination to save his neighbor's land. He saw the strength and camaraderie of the women, who organized a chain to bring water and food to the men. And he saw Eleonora. She was everywhere. She was directing the men at the fire break, her eyes scanning for any change in the wind. She was consulting with the older farmers, listening to their knowledge of the land, incorporating it into the plan. She was tending to a young boy who had gotten a face full of smoke, her touch gentle, her voice calming. She was not a commander. She was the central nervous system of the entire operation, sensing, processing, and responding. By late afternoon, the first field was a blackened, smoking ruin. The fire had been contained. The air was thick with the acrid smell of its passing, but it was the smell of cauterization, of a wound being cleansed. A great exhaustion fell over the workers, but it was mixed with a sense of profound accomplishment. They had faced the disaster and acted. They had not been its passive victims. Alistair found Eleonora by the water carts, her face smudged with soot, her hair escaping its pins. She was staring at the black field, her expression unreadable. "It is done," he said, his voice hoarse. "It is begun," she corrected softly. "The fire was the easy part. Now comes the reseeding, the waiting, the hope." He looked at the blackened earth, then at her. In the past 24 hours, he had learned more about leadership than he had in the 2 years since inheriting his title. He had learned that it was not about giving orders from a position of authority. It was about earning trust, about sharing risk, about recognizing true expertise, no matter its source. "I placed the entire fortune of this estate on your word, Miss Vance," he said, the formality of her name sounding absurd between them now. She finally turned to look at him. "No, Your Grace," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You placed it on a principle documented by a Prussian agronomist in 1819. I was merely the librarian." It was the driest of remarks, a deflection of any personal credit, and yet it was precisely the right thing to say. It was an acknowledgement of the world of facts and evidence they now shared. A small smile touched Alistair's lips, the first genuine smile she had ever seen. It transformed his harsh face, softening the hard lines, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the Duke. "A most resourceful librarian," he said. In that moment, standing in the smoke-filled twilight, surrounded by the ruin and the hope of his land, he felt a shift in the very foundations of his world. The cold, hard principles upon which he had built his life, the avoidance of risk, the suspicion of feeling, the primacy of the bottom line, suddenly seemed like a brittle and inadequate defense against the complexities of the world. He had organized his life around a past wound, and he had called that organization character. He was beginning to see that it was merely a prison. And he was beginning to suspect that the quiet woman standing before him held the key, not just to saving his estate, but to his own liberation. The work of burning the fields was over. The work of rebuilding, he knew, had just begun. The days that followed the Great Fire were quiet, but charged with a new energy. The dramatic act of destruction gave way to the slow, patient work of restoration. Alistair, Eleonora, and the tenants worked side by side to prepare the scorched earth for the winter rye. The rigid hierarchies of Blackwood society seemed to dissolve in the shared labor. The Duke was no longer a remote figure in the great house. He was the man with the blistered hands who knew how to load a seed drill. Miss Vance was no longer the strange, bookish, poor relation. She was the woman who had saved their land, whose quiet instructions were followed without question. Intimacy grew in the spaces between words. It grew in the shared glance over a stubborn patch of soil, in the passing of a water ladle, in the mutual sigh of exhaustion at the end of a long day. Alistair found himself observing Eleonora with a focused intensity he usually reserved for financial ledgers. He noticed the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the small, decisive gestures of her hands, the quiet satisfaction on her face when a difficult task was completed. He was fascinated by the economy of her movements, the precision of her mind. She wasted nothing, not a word, not a motion, not a seed. One evening, after the last of the rye had been sown, he found her in the main glasshouse, the one she called the hospital. It was where she kept the most delicate of her orchids. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms. She was standing before a single plant on a pedestal. A spray of pure white, ghost-like flowers had just opened. It was the Phalaenopsis Eleonorae. "It has bloomed," he said softly, as if not to startle it. "It felt safe enough to do so, I suppose," she replied, her fingers gently touching a petal. It knew the danger had passed. The analogy hung in the air between them, potent and unspoken. The estate, the orchid, perhaps even themselves. "Eleonora," he began, the use of her first name feeling both strange and perfectly natural. He had rehearsed a speech in his mind, a formal apology for his earlier blindness, a declaration of his newfound respect. But looking at her now, in the quiet sanctuary she had created, the words felt hollow and inadequate. "I was wrong," he said instead, the simple words costing him more than any grand pronouncement. "About everything." She turned from the orchid to face him. The lamplight caught the weariness in her face, but also a deep, abiding strength. "You were grieving, Your Grace. And you were afraid. You built walls to protect yourself and this place. It is an understandable impulse." "It was a coward's impulse," he countered, his voice raw with a self-assessment he had never before allowed. "I organized my life around a ghost, the ghost of my brother's folly, the ghost of his wife's betrayal. I called it principle, but it was just fear. I looked at you, and I did not see you. I saw a category of risk. I saw another potential liability to be managed." The confession lay bare between them, stripped of all ducal pride. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was simply stating the truth as he now understood it. A truth she had forced him to see, not with words, but with her unwavering competence and dignity. "And what do you see now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took a step closer. The air was thick with the things they had never said. "I see a woman who saved this estate when I, with all my resources and all my power, was failing. I see a mind sharper than any I have ever encountered. I see a quiet strength that has humbled me. I see Eleonora." He reached out, not to touch her, but to touch the flower. His finger traced the edge of a petal, almost, but not quite, brushing hers. "Your father named this for you. He saw it. He knew. It took me so much longer." Tears she had refused to shed in humiliation or loneliness now pricked at the back of her eyes. They were tears of recognition, of being seen so completely that it was almost painful. "My father believed that the most beautiful things were often the most resilient," she said, her voice thick with emotion. They don't shout for attention. They simply endure and wait for the right conditions to bloom. "And I have provided you with nothing but the harshest of winters," he said, his voice full of regret. "A harsh winter can strengthen the roots," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "If the plant is strong enough." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the culmination of everything that had passed between them: the public humiliation, the quiet work, the shared crisis, the earned respect. He had seen her as an irrelevance, then as a resource, then as a partner. And now? Now he saw her as the missing piece of his own fractured soul. He finally looked away from the orchid and met her eyes. His own were filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I have spent my life trying to restore Blackwood's finances," he said. "You have spent your time here restoring its soul. I am beginning to think one is impossible without the other. I do not know how to do this alone anymore, and I no longer wish to." It was not a proposal of marriage. It was something far more profound. It was a proposal of partnership. He was not offering her a title or a position. He was offering her a place at the center of his world, not as a duchess, but as herself. He was asking her to share the burden and the triumph, the work and the reward. Eleonora looked at this man, this cold, wounded duke who had been transformed by fire and earth and humility. She saw the future of Blackwood, not as a place of wealth and status, but as a living, breathing project, a testament to resilience. And she saw her own future, not as a guest or a dependent, but as a vital part of that project. "The work is not yet finished, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady and clear. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "No," he agreed, "it is not. But I believe we have finally found the right way to begin." He did not kiss her. The intimacy between them was not yet one of touch. It was one of shared understanding, a meeting of minds forged in crisis and solidified in confession. But as he stood beside her in the warm, humid air of the glasshouse, the scent of the newly bloomed orchid filling the space between them, they were closer than any physical embrace could have made them. The winter was over. It was time for spring. The rebuilding of Blackwood did not happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate process, much like the germination of a difficult seed. Alistair did not make a grand announcement of his intentions toward Eleonora. Instead, he simply changed the way the estate was run. He dissolved the formal barrier between the Duke's study and the head gardener's office. Maps and ledgers were spread out on the long library table, and meetings that had once been formal audiences became collaborative discussions. Eleonora's title never officially changed, but her role became undeniable. She was the head of the gardens, and, increasingly, the co-manager of the entire estate. Her first act was to turn the profits from her London flower sales not into luxuries for the great house, but into repairing the tenant cottages, starting with the oldest and most dilapidated. Alistair, who would have once seen this as an expense, now saw it as an investment in the people who made the land productive. He saw it through her eyes. Their partnership was a source of quiet astonishment to the staff and tenants. They saw the Duke, a man they had feared for his coldness, listening with rapt attention as Miss Vance explained the subtle art of grafting apple trees. They saw Miss Vance, the quiet woman they had pitied, correcting the Duke's calculations on crop yields with a gentle but irrefutable logic. They were two halves of a single, functioning whole. Dr. Armitage continued his visits, but the dynamic had shifted. He saw the new light in Eleonora's eyes, the easy, unspoken communication between her and the Duke. He was a good man, and a wise one. He saw that the rare plant he had hoped to cultivate for himself had taken root in its native soil. He offered his sincere congratulations, not on any formal betrothal, but on the revitalization of the gardens, and then his visits became less frequent. He remained a friend, but he was no longer a suitor. The true signal of the emotional resolution came not with a ring, but with a key. One morning, Alistair found Eleonora in the library. He placed a large, ornate iron key on the desk before her. It was old and heavy. "I had the lock repaired," he said. She recognized it instantly. It was the key to the music room. The room had been locked since the death of his brother. It was the room where his brother's wife, the disgraced former Duchess, had held her flirtations, the room that had become synonymous with the betrayal that had scarred him so deeply. "It has been silent for too long," he said. "A house needs music. My mother's pianoforte is still in there. I am told it needs tuning." He looked at her, his gray eyes clear and direct. "I was hoping you might be persuaded to play." It was the ultimate act of trust. He was giving her the key to the most wounded part of his house, and of himself. He was asking her to fill the space left by betrayal with something beautiful. She picked up the key. It was cool and solid in her hand. "I am a better botanist than I am a musician," she said, her voice soft. "Then the pianoforte will be grateful for a patient and methodical hand," he replied, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "I will be a patient audience." She did not become the Duchess of Blackwood that year, or the next. Theirs was a courtship of ledgers and planting schedules, of shared walks through the regenerating fields, and long evenings in the library. When he finally did propose, it was not in a grand ballroom or on a bended knee. It was in the high pasture on a summer evening, as they watched the healthy golden barley ripple in the breeze. "Eleonora," he said, turning to her, "this estate is solvent. The tenants are thriving. The house is secure. But it is not yet a home. It will not be a home for me until you are its mistress. Will you marry me?" She looked at the land, their land, stretching out before them, healed and whole. She looked at him, his face no longer a mask of cold control, but open and full of a love she had earned, and which she returned in equal measure. "Yes, Julian," she said, "I will." 5 years later. The afternoon sun, low and golden, streamed through the tall windows of the Blackwood Library. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air and cast a warm glow on the scene within. Julian, the Duke of Alistair, sat in a large armchair by the fire, a sleeping child with a shock of dark hair nestled in the crook of his arm. In his other hand, he held a book, but he was not reading. He was watching his wife. Eleonora, the Duchess of Alistair, was kneeling on the floor, her head bent in concentration beside their 3-year-old daughter, a little girl with her mother's serious eyes. They were not playing with dolls. They were examining a fallen leaf with a magnifying glass, its intricate veins a source of endless fascination. "You see, Rose?" Eleonora was saying softly. "It is like a map. It shows where the water traveled to give the leaf life." The library, once Eleonora's solitary sanctuary, was now the heart of their home. The ledgers were still there, on a side desk, but they were joined by children's drawings and scattered wooden toys. The room smelled not just of old paper and beeswax, but faintly of milk and the sweet scent of a child's hair. The estate had flourished beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The Vance method of crop rotation was spoken of with reverence in agricultural circles. The blackwood blooms, especially the rare orchids Eleonora cultivated, were famous throughout Europe. The Eleonora, the phantom white orchid, was her signature, a symbol of a beauty that was both delicate and impossibly resilient. But the true measure of their success was not in the ledgers. It was in the sound of laughter that now echoed in the long galleries, in the easy way the tenants greeted their Duke and Duchess, not as feudal lords, but as respected partners. It was in the quiet, unshakable peace that had settled over the house. Julian watched his wife and daughter, a feeling of profound gratitude washing over him. He had thought he needed to build a fortress to protect himself from the world. Eleonora had shown him that the only true strength was in opening the gates, in tending the garden, in nurturing life. She had not just saved his estate, she had saved him from the cold, empty prison of his own pride. She looked up, as if feeling his gaze, and her eyes met his across the room. She smiled, a slow, warm smile that held within it the entire history of their love, the shared work, the quiet understanding, the hard-won peace. It was a smile that said, "Look what we have built together." He smiled back, his heart full. The house was no longer a monument to past wounds. It was a testament to the patient, persistent, and ultimately triumphant power of a love that had been sown in barren soil, and had, against all odds, bloomed. The future of Blackwood was secure, not because of its title or its wealth, but because it was, at last, a home.